All right, Andrew Buckholz is here from Awful Announcing. He got almost 2,500 people who watch the NFL to tell us what they like and dislike about dozens of the best, well, the top, the only booths across the whole league, from Netflix to Fox and everywhere else. So we're going to go through a few that surprised us, a few that maybe got a lot of attention throughout the season, and whether they're over, under, or properly rated. So let's start at CBS with Ian Eagle and Charles Davis. They got a playoff game during Wild Card Weekend, and I suggested that we talk about this one for one very specific reason, guys, which, Andrew, I'll throw it to you first. I think that this is kind of like the Mendoza line booth for what qualifies as being like, I'm good if they call a playoff game, but I'm not going to be jumping up and down when I hear them coming through my speakers, and I'm probably not going to ever turn it off. It's just kind of I'm in good hands, and that's the most I can say. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think our readers who voted in this would certainly agree with you. I mean, what stood out to me about the results for Eagle and Davis were I gave them the title of readers' least hated 2024 booth
Yeah.
because they got the
Yeah.
lowest amount of Fs. And that's despite getting a lot more votes than a lot of the one game booths or the altcast booths. They also got the highest percentage of passing grades in this poll. So even if there were a significant amount of people who really loved them, who gave them A's, but even those who don't like them quite that much would often give them a B or a C rather than a D or an F.
I should say they were fifth on our total rankings here. Ben, what do you think of this duo?
Yeah, I think that you kind of nailed it. They're kind of the Mendoza line of what a high level NFL booth is. I looking back at my Tom Brady criticism or analysis, actually my praise of him, and my whole thing was like, if Tom Brady can just be like as good as Charles Davis, which probably wasn't fair to Charles Davis because Charles Davis is a really good analyst. He just doesn't have the same star power as some of the other top analysts. So that's where this booth, I guess you could say, is lacking. But I don't know how much that actually matters to the typical viewer.
Yeah, to me, first of all, Charles Davis, when I hear him, I just think of Madden and I get mad. That's kind of like the emotional response is Charles Davis, the thing, because video games, it's just those same recognizable one liners, and you know what's coming when you throw an interception or you fumble it, and he's going to say the damn thing, and then you're going to be even more angry with yourself. That's kind of like the recipe with him, and so that's part of it that I think maybe I'm responding to. But I'm going to say this on him before we jump to a Fox booth next year because I'm going to be speaking a little bit out of both sides of my mouth. Because I kind of want Davis to try a little bit more of what Brady does, which is I kind of want to hear, or like what Troy Aikman does, as another example, where he's not afraid to weigh in on the bigger picture stuff going on in the league. Davis almost is like a radio color commentator where he's just delivering the beat by beat. And I think that's where it comes up a little short. I would think that this is probably heavily skewed toward people liking Iron Eagle quite a lot, and that's where maybe them getting all the way up to fifth is coming from. But like I said, certainly good hands. Ben already mentioned the next booth we're going to, which is Brady and Kevin Burkhardt. Andrew, what was the general vibe from our respondents and readers at Awful Announcing about the most talked about NFL booth of the year?
Yeah, so this booth finished 14th of the 25 we looked at. That's obviously Brady wasn't ranked last year with him being new to this. But it's a huge dive for Burkhardt, who had done very well with Greg Olsen, and Greg Olsen obviously wound up in our top ranked booth here with Joe Davis. So I think an interesting thing with the Brady and Burkhardt evaluation is how much of it is about the actual commentary of Brady and how much of it is people mad that Greg Olsen got bumped out of this booth. And I think the voting that had Olsen and Davis at the very top is an example that there were a fair bit of people thinking that way. And the comments for both of those booths also really showed that. I think another interesting thing with in the comments, there were a lot of people who talked about that maybe there's too much hate for Brady, that they found him better as an announcer than the general discourse on sites like ours might indicate. And I think a big part of that is really the spotlight. It's him going from not calling games at all, not really having any media experience at all, apart from his podcast, to being thrust onto the number one team. I think if this was, say, the third or fourth Fox team, we'd have a lot less discussion about them every week, and I think they'd be seen a lot more favorably. But with that bright spotlight comes a lot of criticism.
Ben, that's exactly what we talked about all year with Brady, is like Olsen got to call non-NFL games. He got to call random bye-week games when he was still a tight end. And we didn't have to think about him until all of a sudden he was great at it and we all loved it. Now Brady, they're telling us this is a big deal by how much they're paying him, and the fact that they demoted our favorite guy, it invited the scrutiny and the negativity, I feel like.
Yeah, I mean, Greg Olsen was calling XFL games. Like, so he really like climbed his way from the bottom rung of Fox's broadcasting barrel to all the way to the top. And I think you and I, Brendan, I don't know where you stand on this, Andrew, is we're in agreement that this is probably one and done for Tom Brady. And I think whenever it ends, when we look back on Tom Brady as a broadcaster, I think a part of it is going to be fans really liked Greg Olsen, and they were upset that Greg Olsen got demoted from the top booth. And it was kind of a perfect storm. And I agree. Like, I think Tom Brady is perfectly passable. I think if you were to slot him in to a third or fourth booth, we wouldn't have a single conversation, but that's not the cards that's never been in the cards for Tom Brady. He was going to be the top booth or not. And so I just think, as we approach this Super Bowl that Tom Brady's going to call, like, I think the legacy of this whole thing is kind of coming into focus here.
I think
you said this whole thing. It wasn't just me, Ben. We both did it. Andrew, go ahead.
The one note I'd maybe just add there is that there is an interesting precedent for this, and even in our announcer ratings with Jason Witten a few years ago on going from never having called anything to being on Monday Night Football every week. And if you look at the announcer rankings for Witten with Joe Tess and Booger that first year, they were way harsher and way more critical than anything for Burkhardt and Brady here. Burkhardt and Brady wound up in about the middle of the pack, whereas the Witten booth was way down at the bottom, which is obviously terrible for a primetime one booth thing. Yeah. So I think even if this does wind up being one and done, it may be a disastrous failure in terms of the hype, the money invested, and so on. It's far from the most disliked announcing we've ever seen.
I do think it has a lot to do with who you're replacing, who's being demoted or who's going away in the place of you. Where I think people did like that Tirico and Gruden booth, right? And so then the fact that had gone away, I think it was also the rub of the other guys, and Witten just sort of got the bulk of it. But the Boogermobile was obviously a disaster there, and even the play-by-play, and ESPN was just sort of in a dark zone. They didn't know where they were going. But then I think on the Fox side of it, it's funny because, like, obviously Olsen got the top spot in our rankings. A lot of people like him. It does kind of surprise me that the average fan loves him so much, because he is pretty nerdy, I think, compared to some. But he's also the most demotable guy. You're not going to get rid of Chris Collinsworth. Tony Romo makes too much money. Troy Aikman, I think some people could even argue, is better than Greg Olsen and was very close to the top of our rankings as well, and everything else. So it's hard to really poke holes in the fact that Brady went and took his spot, because he's the most green guy. He just also happens to be one of the most beloved ones. Real quick, Ben, what do you think of Burkhardt?
He's fine. He's passable. He doesn't, I'm a big Joe Buck fan. I feel like Joe Buck adds to broadcasts in a way that most play-by-play guys don't. Burkhardt to me is like, he's there. I don't, I think he's kind of dependent on who he's in the booth, which I think is reflected in the difference between his ratings with Witten or with Olsen, I'm sorry, and his ratings with Brady.
I kind of agree with you. I think that, and the reason I wanted to ask is like I think there's been so much talk with this booth that, oh, thank God he landed with Burkhardt, and it's like, yeah, but not as if it's some sort of saving grace. And I think he does set Brady up. They clearly have a good relationship in chemistry where he cues Brady up. He also knows when Brady is stumbling and not knowing what to say next, and he'll pick it back up from there. And that all helps, but. I don't think Burkhardt is the very, very top either, and I think that our respondents kind of spoke to that. We didn't do over, under, or properly rated with Davis and Eagle, so let's go back there, and then we'll do this one, or with Davis and Eagle. I think overrated. I think fifth is too high for a booth that's the second booth at a network. I mean, even if you just say Brady and Burkhardt maybe are a little lower, you still got what, like, 7-8 other teams to pick from there. I don't think that the second booth at CBS, with what I said about Davis in particular, quite gets me there. So I'm going to go fifth is overrated for that one. What do you got, Ben?
I'd say properly rated. I think when you factor in that the Brady booth is not going to be in the top 5, that does leave, some room to climb up. And so if we agree like they're worthy of a playoff game, then yeah, five is probably about right.
Andrew?
I think they're actually underrated. They came in second overall in our rankings last year.
Wow,
and
I think that. Okay.
And I think it shouldn't just be about who gets the top assignment from a network. I think that's how the network people think, but I don't think that is necessarily indicative of what actually makes a good booth. I think a lot of how you rank these guys is going to depend on your thoughts on that A booth of Nance and Romo. And I personally would rather listen to Eagle and Davis than Nance and Romo. And our readers overall would as well. Nance and Romo finished 6th, 1 spot behind them. And interestingly enough, the third booth of Kevin Harlan and Trent Green finished 1 spot ahead at 4th. So, I mean, I think I think it was relatively fair for all those to be pretty close to each other. I think those are all very good booths, and which one you like comes down a lot to personal preference on what you want in a broadcast. But I do think 5 is maybe a little low for these guys, especially considering the response they got last year.
I like it. I think people, it's too en vogue to hate Tony Romo. We're not getting to that booth, but people need to people need to shut up about him. Okay. Over, underrated, Brady Burkhardt at 14th, Ben.
I'd say overrated. I don't think it's been a great experience.
I agree. I think 14th is actually too high, even with that said. I think we just need to, the kid gloves are beyond done with Brady. He's not good enough to be in the spot that he's in, and he's not as good as a lot of these people. And honestly, some of the people behind him are altcast guys who probably just suffered because they didn't actually get much shine, but maybe would even be above Brady if they actually were working consistently. But Andrew, what do you think on Brady and Burkhardt?
Yeah, I also think a bit overrated. I think the numerical score for them is probably about fair. They got a 2.17, so that's like just C minus ish essentially. And I think that's fair. But I think there are booths behind them that have been working together longer, which I think is a big thing. And you get, and they have a lot more chemistry, and I think give you a better in-game experience watching them. And I think the reason why Brady and Burkhardt wound up here is part of what you were talking about they're that number 1 booth. They get that level of focus. And I think we're at a point where we're seeing a backlash to the backlash of Brady isn't actually that bad. Everyone hates on him too much. And so I think that led them to maybe be a little higher in the rankings than they deserve, but maybe not in the numerical grade.
If it was Kevin Burkhardt and John Smith, I think they would have finished 20th. Eisen and Kurt Warner is our last one. NFL Network, they called my team's Week 18 game on a Saturday. They call the early morning games overseas a lot of the time. And I think, they're in the studio together on Sunday mornings as well. I think Warner has sort of grown as a guy that breaks through as an analyst over time. But I think the play-by-play, Ben, is the part where this one kind of goes south for a lot of people. They were 15th. We'll just speed through this one. Over, under, or properly rated for Eisen and Warner on NFL Network.
I thought overrated. I'm not a Rich Eisen guy. I think you're either a Rich Eisen guy or you're not a Rich Eisen guy. I'm not. I don't know if it's a Ohio State Michigan thing. He's just never been my cup of tea. And so I think he's kind of a weird fit as a play-by-play guy because he is such a big personality, although I'm kind of contradicting myself there by saying I'm also a big Joe Buck fan. But I don't know.
Joe Buck doesn't have a daily radio show. So.
Exactly. And they also call they usually call the overseas games, right? The Eisen Warner booth. And so they get a lot of bad games too. So maybe that holds them down, but this is probably my least favorite booth, to be honest.
What do you think, Andrew?
See, I think they're a little underrated, actually. And I think all of those points were completely fair when they started. I think this booth was really bad when they first started calling games. Eisen felt very, very out of place there. But I think NFL Network, in my mind, has been smart to stick with these guys as their lead team. They still don't get a lot of reps relative to most teams. They're calling a couple games a year usually, but I think they've really grown together, and I think this is a pretty good product now. They finished right below Brady and Burkhardt in the rankings, and I'd take them over that duo.
All right, I like it. We're gonna go. I'll give them properly rated. I think that I just don't notice. It takes a really terrible play-by-play person for it to really detract from me. I don't think Eisen is quite so bad. Maybe Ben has the bias against Eisen because of the, Big Ten rivalry there. I have some allegiance toward Kurt Warner because he's the only thing that's ever been good to happen to the team that I'm wearing on my head. So I have to give him his credit where it's due. And I do think he's pretty good at breaking stuff down in real time, even when they are calling those bad games. But let's go through each one of us 10, 15, 20, 30 seconds on a booth we think. I think all of these are our underrated booths that we would like to highlight here. So I'll start off. I think Adam Amin and Mark Sanchez. I know that Sanchez had some flubs that got a lot of attention, including ones we covered. I think he said the wrong thing a few times, and just our respondents said he felt a little loose, a little out of sorts, but hey, that's what happens when you have not done this very much. And I think that Adam Amin is one of the best guys, could easily be doing a higher level booth if the opportunity arose, and would be perfectly in place there. And I think Sanchez, maybe I'm biased because I have seen him in more of a studio environment. He does the herd a lot. He has some good things that break through there. I've suggested him as somebody Fox could promote for its college side to give him some higher up reps. I just think he really knows his stuff and seems pretty ready to work hard at this whole thing. So I'll give it to him, and I'll say that they're my underrated, need some shine booth. Who do you got, Ben?
My underrated one came in at 19. It is the Tom McCarthy, Jay Feely, Ross Tucker booth. And this is primarily a nod to Ross Tucker, who I think is a rising star as a broadcaster. They called a few Cleveland Browns games that I was locked in on this season, and those were not pretty games, and they made the most of them. I noticed in our comments, like, Jay Feely took a lot of the crap from the people who didn't like this booth. I like the idea of having like a kicking specialist. I think that's a unique angle. And then going back to Ross Tucker, he's very online, which I appreciate. And so I think when you do have somebody online and who's doing local radio hits and who's conversing with you through social media, like, that to me adds to the experience of when they're calling my team's game. So I thought 19, I mean, that was just behind the Simpsons booth. Come on, this is better than the Simpsons altcast.
Hey, you like Mina, though, so.
I do.
All right, Andrew, what you got?
So my underrated one is Kenny Albert and Jonathan Vilma of Fox. They were 16th of 2.07. And we've talked about chemistry a lot, and I think this is a booth that really shows the value of chemistry. They've been working together for a few years now. Vilma was really rough when he started, but I think he's grown significantly as a broadcaster, and I think a lot of his growth has having that continuous pairing with Albert, who is a real pro at this, who he's great at calling the NFL. He's called so many sports and continues to call so many sports, basketball, hockey, etc. And I think he's been exactly the steady hand Vilma needed. And I really like having Vilma as the analyst there, because there's not a lot of defensive guys in these roles. To me, it's a different perspective. It's an underrepresented perspective. And I think that duo has really brought the best out of each other, and Fox has been smart to leave them together and let them grow.
Yeah, I believe Kenny Albert celebrated 500 NFL games this past season. Insane. So definitely deserves some shine, and the Vilma improvement is a helpful factor. But yeah, maybe the lesson of this whole thing is to give these guys time to marinate, and that does go a very long way, even though the constant musical chairs is understandable with these executives trying to take talent and promote people, and agents trying to, vie for whatever seat they might want. But the product for us in our couches, I think, benefits from that time. All right, thank you, Andrew. People can check out the article at awfulannouncing.com. A lot of work went into it. Very good stuff to take away from what everyone across this whole landscape of watching the NFL thinks about all the people who broadcast the NFL. Ben and I will be back to close out the show next.